Sorry.
No, it's good.
And
I'm glad
then
you're recording.
now I'm recording. And now I'm putting up my slides. And now I'm going to just show you something that it came out of the Economist. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
this is smallpox in London. God bless them. They've been taking good statistics going back to 1630. And the reason I'm showing this, I'm looking at immunization records in the past, and we are getting impatient. But if we look at the past and we see how long it took immunization and vaccination to be successful in the past, maybe we'll have some understanding about why we're having a hard time doing it on a global context. Which is in itself is historical, that there's a global focus on this project. But you can see it had an impact on politics. Mary II, one of the factors that killed her was a smallpox. So we'll get to her. She's Bloody Mary, Juan Jose, in our history of Britain that we hold so close. And then we talked a little bit about variolation. I'll review that in just a second, but it was introduced in 1700. It was not an immunization per se. It was taking the real smallpox and trying to create a small infection. And it didn't work 10% of the time. And George III had a son that died from it. I mentioned before about Adams, John Adams' family. I'm going to go to the next slide because these things, this is kind of small. So this is before the introduction of the smallpox vaccine. And so now we're up to 1770s. And then in 1796, Jenner discovers the cowpox, and I'll review that in just a second. Then it was so successful that variolation as a practice was actually banned in London. Newborns in London, vaccination became mandatory. Franco-Prussian War in the 1871, you saw a surge of it again, showing that social disruption is a problem. I've showed this slide before. We've derived the word vaccination. It's from vaca, Spanish. And why is it vaca? Because the cowpox that affected the udders of cows affected the udders of milkmaids, and a very observant doctor noticed that and started the campaign for immunization. Before that, it wasn't using cowpox, which is benign. It was using the actual smallpox itself. And we know that George Washington insisted that it be used in his troops because his younger brother had almost died of smallpox serving in the British Navy. And we saw in the history of John Adams on that miniseries that Abigail had her kids. And one of them, as we saw in that series, almost dies of it, was almost joined that 10%. So it was a calculated risk. Do I go for a 10% risk now, or 100% if it comes our way? So polio. is another success. And this is me in 1955. I got my polio shot. And boy, oh boy, were my parents relieved. Before then, polio was a feared disease, particularly in the summertime. The father of a friend of mine died. People couldn't breathe if it ascended, and they had to be kept alive on iron lungs. When I came to the county hospital in 1972, there were still iron lungs up on the rehabilitation ward. They were never used, but they kept them there just in case somebody had missed the immunization. And we were declared polio free. If you want to read a book about the psychology of living in an epidemic as opposed to a pandemic, read Philip Roth's Nemesis. Philip Roth's Nemesis. It's written describing the reaction of the citizenry in Newark, New Jersey, to an epidemic in the 1940s. And it pitted Italian Americans against Jewish Americans. They were each suspicious that the other had it and was passing it on. It's really a intriguing look at that phenomenon. I recommend it highly. Measles, I had measles as a kid. Everybody had measles before 1963. And boy, oh boy, has that changed the practice of medicine. It was improved the year I graduated from medical school, and that and all the other pediatric immunizations have made my life practicing urgent care, emergency room care, more tolerable. I'm sure Carol's Neil would second me on that. It's amazing. There was a good response, but then it spiked up in the world, and this international global alliance got involved. Bill Gates is involved in that, and measles came back down. This is in Nigeria. And just finally, the success that we've had since 1990. The blue is the amount that's been reduced by immunization. And tetanus, what a great success. Measles, what a great success globally. We saw on the slide in America, it was controlled by the 1970s, 1980s, but not in the world, but we're getting there. And one of the problems is the suspicion of Islamic fundamentalists against immunization, that it's a trick. The diphtheria reduced. Haemophilus meningitis way down. Tuberculosis is stubbornly high. Malaria is stubbornly high. The other final point I'd make is smallpox. The last case of smallpox, the actual single patient was observed by a number of workers in the area, and it was in Nepal. And they zeroed down to this one village where the last case of smallpox was. This story is told wonderfully by that epidemiologist that I've mentioned before. Bright, I think was his last name. Was that his last name, Aiko? Anyway, that's that. So I just wanted to do a quick review as we're getting impatient with the vaccination of the world and even the vaccination of the Bay Area. So,
It was either bright or brilliant. I can't
well,
remember.
oh, you're right. It's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You don't have a haircut like George Washington, but you're still a very good student, Aiko. Um, that's an obscure reference to an early conversation. Sorry. So back to the Middle Ages, folks. We've been detained long enough, and I want to just review quickly what was the basic theology in the high Middle Ages that had made the church so successful, and it was basically St. Augustine, the alpha dog from Carthage. And he had successfully merged some of the best philosophical traditions of the Greeks and the Jews with the new Christianity. And he was the guy, and it was his work that was bolstered by all the monastic movements in medieval time, in the Middle Ages. And what did he say? His city of God just pointed out and reinforced the Old Testament that man's a sinner, and we are restless, and we have to pray and to God to help control our sinfulness and our restlessness. And that word restless got me going, because if you look at the early beginnings of Homo sapiens and our movement around the globe, we are one restless species. And Juan Jose asks about what is civilization. A lot of what civilization is controlling that restlessness. And that's what Augustine and Christianity did. But Augustine was a late starter. This is one of his prayers. He put it in his book called The Confessions. The Lord make me pure, but not yet. Why did he not want to go? He was a sinner in the flesh pots of Carthage, well documented. He went from woman to woman. He had one particular mistress that he was with for 10 years, and I think it was this prayer was addressed to her. Nobody ever figured out her name. I looked and I looked for this lecture, and it's unknown, but there's some mistress that kept him from committing totally to Christ. So I mentioned when I did my little riff on inspirational medieval art, 1200, 1300, Giotto in that church in Padua. And I ended with his 7 deadly sins in the counter. And I ended with hope, because this seemed to be a new theme in the High Middle Ages, hope. And here's another new theme that we're going to look at in more detail. And it's a particular characteristic, I'd argue, of Western Europe. And it is a kind of skepticism, a questioning, a willingness to challenge authority. And whose authority is he challenging? He's challenging the church. He flirts a little bit with heresy, and we're going to see his flirting involved a little bit more than theology. So he famously said, "I would not be an Aristotle if it were to part me from God." Well, this is just hedging. This is just hedging, because his main point was to challenge God, and he had what's called an impish skepticism, a playfulness. And where did he act this out? in the Cathedral School of Notre Dame. This is before the University of Paris and his successor, Thomas Aquinas. So you can look at him as a forerunner of Thomas Aquinas, who is the main theologian whose ambition was to unite philosophy with Aristotle's knowledge. And remember, it was Aquinas who wrote the book that purported to have all the knowledge that existed in the world. So here he is tutoring, and he is tutoring a young lady named Eloise. And this is Sir Thomas Aquinas. All the knowledge was in Summa Theologica, and everybody said it was a total success, that he really nailed it, and this would be probably the last book that would need to be written. But back to Abelard and Eloise. His tutoring famously progressed to amorous love. She was a guardian. Her parents had died, and her uncle was her guardian. And he becomes the villain in this love story. And what a love story it is. They have an affair. They have a kid secretly. They name him, you can't make this stuff up, astrolabe, which was a nautical device used on ships, a great technological advance. They got married secretly, but part of their strategy was she had to pretend to be a nun. She didn't want to have anything to do with taking the robe. The uncle finally caught on to what was going on and had henchmen come and castrate Peter Abelard. And then that was when his conversion could take place, like St. Augustine, arguably. He then, after being castrated, went all in and became a monk, and begged her, they still had their relationship, and he begged her to join him. And she said, resisted. And she said, no, I have no calling. Finally, in their famous letters, they refer to each other finally as brother and sister. So she relents. And in that time period, he writes his great masterpiece called Yes or No. And in it, he argues that, you can't be blamed for the acts you might commit in the variables and vicissitudes of fate. It's your intent. It's what's in your heart that counts, and what God will judge you by. And so this was a kind of an original thought. Their relationship continued. Finally, he dies. Eloise is given the body and buried it. When she dies, she is buried alongside of him. But because of the scandal and the notoriety and their fame, their bodies together are moved quite often, which only added to the romance of the story. And of course, during the French Revolution, they were held up as being paragons of free thinking, new thinking. And to romantics all over Europe, they have become the symbol of lovers and romance and unrequited love. I give their soap opera more time than history maybe would allocate to it. But I think it's an important story, and it has lived on. And Juan Jose, I think enduring stories like the story of Abelard and Eloise are what help define what civilization is. The enduring stories will tell you a lot. And this story of free thinking, daring authority, I think is an enduring story that accounts for a little bit about the rise of the West in the world, which when we get to our next era after 1500 will become more and more of the theme. By the way, if you saw Being John Malkovich, there's a puppet show by John Cusack, has unrequited love. He's familiar and identifies with Abelard, and he makes puppets and enacts the love story between Eloise and Abelard. I was gonna show it, but if anybody wants to see it, I'll send you the YouTube. So there, of course, there's, for every action, there's a reaction, and you get a fundamentalist reaction. And this guy, Bernard, resisted Abelard's reasoning and said, faith is enough for mystical union with God. Interestingly enough, the Arabs had the same debate the preceding session, and in their case, the fundamentalists won forever. Yeah, okay, I'll stick with forever for now, but of course that can be challenged. So what's going on in China is interesting. While Europe is building all these universities that we talked about earlier, and here are the dates that they come in to being, and I've showed you a table before of this. China only has one isolated monolithic university. They have exams and people study the Confucian books, but they don't have this pluralism of thought. And arguably it's the spirit of Abelard that is spread through this time. Remember, he's in the early 1100s. And this is of interest, not just intellectually, but monarchs that are emerging, the first among equal of the warlords, and businessmen, which we learned when we studied the development of towns, are really interested and want universities to throw out people that can think, that can do numbers, can be accountants, can help them with their business. Like Juan Jose is going to be helping business people, probably, as we think, this group thinks, probably on a global basis, but that we're just a little overconfident for you, Juan Jose. So all these universities are well placed. They're drawing on the classical knowledge of the Mediterranean. They've been exposed to the Arabic Great Leaps Forward, which we studied when we did our whole run through Islam. And of course, the Jewish wisdom is preserved through Christianity indirectly. And last but not least is the wisdom of the Byzantine, where we've seen they've had great thinkers like Justinian. So these universities are in a well positioned to promote diverse thinking. But I'll just have to say, in medicine, they really blew it. They were very wrong. And the four humors and the four elements held medicine back for a long time. And when I did my history of cancer, maybe Carol remembers and Aiko remembers, I talked about how this theory really held back the approach to treating cancer for a long time. Some of these words will notice, the four humors, melancholy, choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic. They live on in words like that, but they certainly don't live on in science. And it took somebody like Vesalius to point out how crazy it was that when he was dissecting, he never saw any evidence of the four humors or any of the bile associated with the four humors. He saw blood, but he never saw black bile. He never saw yellow bile. Progressing on from thinkers like Abelard, it spills over, and now we're getting a new science. And one of the first leaders of this is Roger Bacon. He was a Franciscan who started off in Oxford, and this is probably why Oxford today is a center of thinking, and why their name is associated with one of the vaccines. It's struggling, by the way, AstraZeneca. And maybe next week I'll give a little update on that. But here he is around 1250, and he is the first to do practical experiments with optics, and chemistry, and astronomy. Now, Arab scientists had done some of this stuff. Okay, so this I'm not saying he broke absolute new ground, but he's part of this collection of knowledge from the past. So now back to the church, and at the peak of the High Middle Ages, the glory of God and the success of the church at its pinnacle of power. And what do? They build monuments, they build cathedrals, 80 cathedrals in France alone, in addition to all the abbey churches and thousands of parish churches. Just a remarkable building splurge, which stands as a metaphor for the power of religious thought at its peak. And we see it today when we travel. I mean, every time I walk into a cathedral, I'm overtaken with the massiveness of it. It just grabs me and pulls me into a different frame of mind. And it was Aiko explained it very well when she talked about Sainte-Chapelle and about Gothic innovation, the flying buttresses, the lifting of the roof, allowing the roof to go so much higher, which stuns us today. Notre Dame, various cathedrals around Europe. And Juan Jose, when you get there, be sure to go to every cathedral you can find. They're breathtaking, and they capture and beautiful art inside them, paintings, but also sculpture of great religious figures. Chartres being one of them, and I think I've mentioned in a previous talk about the cathedral in Oakland. And Juan Jose, if you ever get to the Bay Area, I'll take you to the great Cathedral of Light in Oakland. I'm not religious, and I'm certainly not a Catholic, but I walk into that place and I see a 60-foot image of Jesus and as portrayed in a sculpture at Chartres, one of the greatest Gothic cathedrals in Europe. And it really grabs me and takes my breath away, puts me in a different frame of mind. There's a new confidence now with this high Middle Ages. And this new confidence leads to expansion. And so maybe a germ of its own coming fall. It expands. Maybe it's overconfident, but it's going to lead to things like colonialism, religious wars, acquisitive capitalism, and the Viking spirit. So some bad things are going to come from human beings acting out on new confidence. By 1500, we've got a very different map. The Islamic world has expanded, and it's outflanking Europe. Before Ferdinand and Isabella, it extends into Spain. And the University of Cordoba, by the way, all these universities are sending me emissaries to Cordoba to pick up what they've preserved from Mediterranean, Greek and Roman civilization. That's where it lived in Arab cities. And it's via the Arabs that Europe can build on its own history. We're going to see that also Europe is going to be outflanked by the Mongols and the Ottoman Empire. That's coming up. We're going to see that Christianity spreads with this new confidence. It spreads especially to the northeast, but let's look at that individually. Into the north, the last place that has remained pagan is the Balkans. The Balts were resistant to outside influences. They were isolated enough there at the eastern end of the Baltic Sea. But the Crusaders returning home said, now what? And they said, well, you know, there's infidels still up in the Baltic area. So the Teutonic Knights, off they go. And they head across what we would call northern Germany through Poland. Now, Poland's a different story, and I'm going to talk about Poland when I talk about Russia, which is coming next. And in they go to Lithuania and what becomes Latvia and Estonia. Spreading Christianity to the pagans at the southern end of the Baltic Sea, the last holdout of Europe. Russia had converted, and we'll be talking about that soon. So they were between a rock and a hard place, and the Crusaders ended it, but not without a lot of bloodshed and suffering. Now, they also expanded south. It's a little bit off the screen, sorry, south, and the Reconquista. So I've been talking all about the Arabs in Cordoba in Spain, but the tribes in the north, Gothic tribes held over from the fall of Rome, who lived in the Pyrenees. The Galatians, the Basques, the original people that had not yet been replaced even by the Celts. They're an ancient people, their language unrelated to Indo-European. And then Finally, Aragon falls to these troops, and then Castile, and then we get Ferdinand and Isabella. So there's an expansion, well, let's say south. So it's coming south from the Pyrenees. It's going to see the removal of Arabs who had been there for almost 700 years in Spain, and certainly is going to lead eventually to the settlement of your country, Juan Jose. To the west, Leif Erikson finds the New World, unheralded at the time, but it happened. So what is going on with the church? This is I want to only look at the left-hand side of this. I think we've looked at this before. Forget the right-hand side for now. We'll get to it. But at its peak, the church prides itself on being God's dwelling place on earth, particularly in these cathedrals. A sanctuary, the cathedral is. You go in there and you reach towards heaven. You see all the statues and paintings, the symbolism. You learn how to read and write at the church schools. And you go every Sunday to get your reassurance of salvation, that word that comes from the mystery religions that we first saw, Juan Jose, when we studied the late Roman Empire and the mystery religions of the Middle East and Asia Minor. And interestingly enough, a lot of the people, the artisans that worked on these cathedrals were anonymous. So the political organization, some observers say, hey, the Western culture may not have succeeded. The Vikings came in and almost destroyed everything. But somehow, led by the church, medieval society, the Middle Ages, pulled itself back together again. And this is a controversial statement that the influence of the German tribes, remember, they're part of a triumvirate that created Western civilization. The German tribes, the Mediterranean tradition, and then the church synthesizing both. But Western Europe had to deal with the idea that the state wasn't the main thing, and that persisted because the church became the main pillar of civilization for centuries. But at some point, you've got to go on and at least, who knows, maybe we shouldn't have gone on. Maybe we should have stayed there. But we evolved eventually into monarchs taking over from the other minor warlords and creating what we call nations. It was no longer based on das Volk. It was going to be based on what's now pejoratively called the deep state. Now, when we look at the development of nations, we've got to start with the exceptions. And the exceptions are interesting. The exceptions are the Germans and the Italians. They did not unify until the 1860s and 1870s. So we're not going to be talking about unified states there. And maybe to understand what allowed other states to unify, let's look at what kept the Germans and the Italians from unifying. You remember the investiture controversy and how the head of the Holy Roman Empire was forced to walk barefoot through the snow to ask the Pope to forgive him so he wouldn't be excommunicated anymore. Was it the Alps that played a role in preventing languages from spreading? That's one theory. Another theory is that you look at these rivers and you see that they can lead to a north-south trade, and that it was the people who benefited from this north-south trade, the Italians, who were well positioned, particularly in Venice and Genoa over here, to trade, to get the trade from the Silk Road ultimately into Europe. So they became, there was a lot of local economic wealth, which translated into political power. And as we're about ready to see, this sense of skepticism, of thinking outside the box, is going to lead to the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther. And of course, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but that's certainly one thing that caused a continuing pluralism in Germany. And meanwhile, in France and in England, they were successfully building nations and states, unified states. And in fact, the goal of French diplomacy was to keep Germany divided. So they played spoiler in that. So the city-states and aristocracies in the Holy Roman Empire kept Germany from uniting. Ditto in Italy, city-states. We keep dealing, and Milano, Juan Jose, was probably the leading city-state, the most prosperous one, being right there at the base of the Alps. And when the Alps were finally pierced, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, Milano benefited from that. And the Habsburgs, being on the other end, on the north side of the Alps, also benefited. And we've told the story of the Habsburgs. This is a more consolidated Germany. There's a preceding map. This is the Germany of 1869, before the War of 1871, that unified the whole thing under Bismarck. But this was at one point 300 different principalities. And when you travel around Germany, you go from one castle to another, and it's local warlords holding power, and their local commercial power prevented unification over the Holy Roman Empire under the Holy Roman Emperor. And it was neither holy nor Roman, and the emperor was not really an emperor, but just a minor warlord that got elected, by the way. And this is in contrast to the Habsburg story in Spain and Austria, and we've talked about why that's an exception, going along with France and England. And we're going to see that the Habsburgs are going to and have already, by the end of our last lecture, had already created a relationship with Hungary. But it's the English monarchs, and that's our history, the history of America, that have been one of the most successful, and maybe arguably more successful than France. And that's the argument I'll make in the next 5 minutes. So England, as you recall, was conquered by the Normans, and they distributed the land to local warlords, and they leveraged the Anglo-Saxon institutions like the sheriff. As we know, the sheriff of Nottingham was a villain in the Robin Hood stories. And they use the Anglo-Saxon institutions of the writ and the inquest. And they were very good at documenting their census and their property in the famous Domesday Book, a wealth survey, if you will. They were very organized, and some of this is a combination of Anglo-Saxon savvy from Alfred, who gave us common law, and some of it is from what what they inherited from their stay in Normandy. You remember, Norman means men of the north, and that those were the Vikings, and it was it were Vikings that came down who became Normans, because the king in Paris at the time bought them off. Say, look, if you leave Paris, we'll give you all of Normandy. And so the Normans picked up a part of French civilization. The English conquest of Ireland is interesting to me because my middle name's McNeil, and I'm from, my ancestors are from Belfast, the area of the O'Neills. And the English suppressed the Irish. You talk about racism. It was terrible racism, to the point where they set up plantations. This was occupied territory. This was the only absolutely safe area. And we have a phrase, beyond the pale, which means you've gone too far. If you went beyond the pale without soldiers, you could be in trouble from the O'Reillys and the O'Farrells. They had a little bit more power here in the purple areas. But it's not until Queen Elizabeth that this northern area is controlled. And this is the racist laws propagated as the statutes of Kilkenny. We don't have to go through this. Just one thing, hurling was outlawed to be replaced by gentlemanlike games. But it discriminated against Irish in all walks of life. The green area in the north at the time was in alliance with other Gaelic tribes in the Highlands and the islands of Scotland. And Elizabeth's strategy was to split that alliance by building plantations in Northern Ireland. And that's what she did. And this is the Wall of Londonderry, or as the Catholics say, Derry. They leave out the London. And this was built as a sanctuary for people who worked on oversaw the plantations where Irish slaves were working. And they at night had to go into this walled city. This was built around 1630. And it's quite something. You can see it on our last trip to Ireland. We came in from the northwest and we're on a hill here, and you can look down on Derry, and it's just a gem of a city, and you can see this city wall. It's quite striking. But that's coming back from Ireland to a summary of the English contributions as I'm about ready to end. The English contributions to history, the common law from Alfred, the medieval law of the Magna Carta, the writs and the inquests that the Normans introduced as part of the bureaucratic state. And here is King John signing the Magna Carta. Ramsey has taught us that this is much exaggerated. This was simply an agreement between the first of equals, the king who had seized and pretended to have total power. This was a backslide, a backpedaling, saying, okay, look, maybe I've taken too much of your rights. Here's what you as submitting feudal lords have as a rights. So that was the Magna Carta, but it's come to stand for a lot of things that happened afterwards that we talked about when we talked about, say, the Glorious Revolution. That was much more important than the Magna Carta. And we've gone over this slide many times, the difference between common law and Roman law. And so this is a good stopping point. This is the High Middle Ages. We've got some nations that are being formed, mainly England and in France. We have the church, which is about ready to fall onto hard times. And that is what we'll see next week when we enter the later Middle Ages. There's about 7 or 8 bad things that are going to happen and in Western Europe, and it's going to lead to a dramatic reconfiguration. And Juan Jose will have an opportunity yet one more time to see civilization rebuild itself, and rebuild itself it does. But you'll see some of the germs of that civilization in what we talked about today. So I will end it there and ask if there are any questions.
I have to remember this is Carol. I have to remember my question. I think it was way back near the beginning. You said there was I'm wondering what the basis of the confidence was in Europe, given that they were surrounded by all the Muslims.
Well, I mean, there was some insulation, and there was some anxiety. The anxiety coming from attacks on Vienna twice. The Turks were at the walls of Vienna twice. So there wasn't, it was a hard-won confidence that came after repelling.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
This was really a tour de France, a tour de force of a lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, folks. I'll see you next week.
Thank
Okay.
you so much, John. I'm
you.
learning so much. I'm really appreciative. Thank you.
Really
Oh, I'm learning a lot too. So that
Great.
makes 2 of us.
This is
See you
great.
next week.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.